One of the biggest problems I had as a beginner photographer was coming back home after a trip only to realize that some of my photos weren't sharp. What I've learned by both trial and error and having workshop participants show me some of the same exact problems, I figured out how to fix these common issues. I'm going to show you my easy process for how I get sharp photos every single time, as well as take you out in the field and show you a cool little hack that I use to make sure that all of my images are tack sharp. The first major issue when it comes to blurry photos is camera shake. This is caused in a few different ways. One is technique and the other is a settings issue. So let's go ahead and start with technique. For me as a landscape photographer, I always shoot on a tripod. This is the best way to eliminate handshake. The second thing is to use a shutter delay. You can do this by setting a 2-second timer, because even when you press that shutter, you introduce a little bit of shake to the camera. A 2-second timer gets rid of any shake from the pressing of the shutter button. Another option is a shutter release, something you can plug into the side of the camera and avoid touching the shutter button altogether. Every camera maker has one, and there are a lot of third-party options available as well. For those of you who don't like shooting on a tripod, there is one concept that you'll need to understand in order to get sharp photos handheld. That is the relationship between your focal length and your shutter speed. So whatever your focal length is, your shutter speed needs to be the inverse of that number or faster. For example, if you're shooting at 50 millimeters, your shutter speed should be at least 1/50th of a second or faster. So 50 millimeters, 1/100th of a second is good, 1/25th is bad. 1/250th of is good, 1/10 bad. There are also some cool technologies in today's cameras and lenses that help with this, like image stabilization or in-camera bodies or on the lenses themselves, but I still recommend sticking to this rule just to be safe. Also, for us mirrorless users, we have something called focus peaking. This allows you to see in real time what is in focus and what isn't. It's such a huge benefit. Another thing to consider, if you're one of those crazy kids like us that shoot with a high megapixel camera, let's say 30 megapixels or higher, I would recommend doubling that rule. So at 50 millimeters, I would never go below 1/100th of a second just to be safe. These higher megapixel cameras are much less forgiving when it comes to camera shake, so just do yourself a favor and get a tripod. The next concept is important to understand. It's called hyperfocal distance. I said it's important to understand, not that it's important to use. There's a key difference there. But first, let's talk about what it means and also how it works. Now, the definition, hyperfocal distance, is the minimum distance from the camera that keeps the objects at infinity acceptably sharp. It takes into account your focal length and your aperture. So let's look at an example. Let's use 24 millimeters and our aperture is at f8. According to the hyperfocal table, give these two variables, our hyperfocal distance is 8 feet. So everything will be sharp from half of that hyperfocal distance all the way out into infinity. Well, let's increase our focal length. This is one way that our hyperfocal distance is going to change. The longer the focal length you use, the further away you'll have to be in order to get everything sharp. So at 50 millimeters with that same aperture of f8, the hyperfocal distance is now 34 feet or 10.5 meters. One way to combat this is you can also increase your depth of field by changing your aperture. Instead of using f8, you could use f11 or f16 to get more photo in focus. If you want to see a hyperfocal table, you can simply Google it, like here on photopills.com, or you can download the PhotoPills app, which has one in there, and I'll show you this when we go out into the field. If you're wondering at this point how often I use the hyperfocal distance, the answer is really never. Can you imagine, hey guys, before I take this shot, I'm gonna walk my steps out and measure out the hyperfocal distance. Like I said, it's important to know what it is and how it works, but also choosing the right aperture and where to focus has more of an impact than just looking at a table, then measuring a distance out to your subject. Now let's quickly go over depth of field, and then we're gonna go out into the field. Depth of field is how much of your image is in focus. You do this by adjusting your aperture. The ideal aperture for getting most depth of field is between f8 and f11. This is the sweet spot. Anything higher like f16 or f18, you're gonna get a negative effect called diffraction, where the light is going through the small aperture in your lens and it gets diffracted, causing soft edges and reduced overall sharpness. I don't ever go above f16 for that reason. All right guys, so now let's head out into the field and to put a few of these tips into practice. We've taken our steps. We've got it on a tripod now, and I've set up my 2-second timer. These 2 steps are always important for me. I always use a tripod. I always use a 2-second timer. If you want, you can use a release instead. This scene here that we're at, I have 3 elements that I want to keep sharp. I have a cholla cactus in the foreground. I have a cholla cactus in the midground. And then I have the mountains in the background I want to be sharp. I'm gonna use the hyperfocal table. I'm gonna pull out my Photo Pills app, and under the hyperfocal table, shooting on my Nikon Z7 II, I'm shooting at f8. I'm at 20 millimeters. According to this chart, I need to be at least 1.69 meters away from my nearest subject. I am probably at about 6, maybe 7 meters away, so I'm around 20 feet or so. But I'm gonna show you guys how I set my focus and how important it is to know where to focus. I'm shooting on a 14 to 30, so I'm gonna zoom all the way in to 30 millimeters, and then I'm going to digitally zoom all the way in to make sure that my focus is set on this cactus here, and just make sure that everything is perfectly sharp. I'm going to zoom back out to my 20 millimeters. Ooh, look at that sky. Man, that is glorious. And there we go. All right, now it's time to double check. I want to do a little bit of a test. Because my hyperfocal distance says with 20 millimeters, I can be 1.69 meters away at f11. I'm gonna get a little bit closer here. I'm maybe about 2.5, 3 meters away. Just because I'm within that hyperfocal distance doesn't necessarily mean that I can focus anywhere and it's gonna be sharp. So I'm gonna try again to focus on this very first cactus. So I'm gonna take the shot now, 2-second timer, everything is good. But now you're gonna see when I zoom in, this first cactus is sharp, but the background is just a little blurry. I mean, just slightly. This is where learning where to focus is gonna come into play. This time, I'm gonna do something a little bit different. I'm gonna focus on that cholla cactus in the midground there. Again, double check, always double check. This foreground cactus is still sharp, even though I focused on that midground cactus, and the background is perfectly sharp. So we have an image now that is sharp from front to back. Everything is in focus, so that is perfect. In the case where I focused on that midground cactus and it still wasn't sharp, I would have 3 options. 1, get further away from your subjects, okay? I could have just simply backed up a little bit and tried it again. And the second thing I could have done is stop down the aperture to increase my depth of field. So instead of shooting at f8, I could have shot at f11 or f16. That would work. In the third scenario where it would be impossible, like there's nothing I could do. I've tried stopping down to f16, I've tried backing up, and I'm still not sharp. Or I prefer a composition where I'm really close to that foreground subject. The next thing I would do is focus stack. So I would take shots at different focal points and then blend them together later in Lightroom and Photoshop. Now, all of these tips have really helped me develop my process so that I don't come home disappointed because I messed up in the field. If anything, you can take away from this right now is always double check the back of your camera before you leave. And until you really get a feel for where to focus on different situations, try focusing on different parts of the scene. That way, when you get back, you have some options. This will help you over time to give you that experience and the confidence. Just remember, the hyperfocal distance is the minimum distance for everything at that point to infinity to be acceptably sharp, but that isn't necessarily where you put your focus point. Keep in mind, not everything in landscape photography needs to be sharp. Sometimes it can even help to have that depth of field. This image here is a perfect example of it being an advantage, not having the mountains in the background sharp. The depth of field creates that separation and it adds depth to the image. I made the decision to place the focus on the dead tree and let the mountains fall out of focus. In this next example, I was using a wide angle lens. I think it was around like 16 millimeters. So I chose to focus about 1/3 into the frame. The immediate foreground is water. So really, it's not that important to keep it sharp, but the canyon walls in the background are tack sharp. If you find yourself in a situation where it's impossible to get everything sharp from front to back, if you're too close to an important foreground subject to get the background in focus, then you want to learn how to focus stack. That is, taking separate photos, choosing a different focus point for each one, and blending them together in Photoshop. It's actually much easier than it sounds. If you're interested, take a look at this video here, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.